Yes. Let me double check.
I'm gonna turn these off. Yeah, you want one back on?
I don't need them back on. Unless you just want to. Okay, this is your 30-second warning. We'll be starting class in 30 seconds. Okay. Well, good morning. We're going to continue our topic of what worship is. And one of the first things that we want to talk about, and I think maybe the most important aspect of worship, is that worship is obedience. Worship is obedience. And I want to unpack that by looking at a passage that we're familiar with. It's one that we know from way back, all of our days, way back for some of us, not so far back for others of us. But it's a story that we can remember back from Bible school. We can have we can recall our teacher sharing that story. And so I pulled up a few images that I want to share with you today. And when I show this first image, you're going to know exactly what story we're going to be looking at. And then I'll tell you where we're going to find it in the Bible, but you'll have a good guess probably. What are we talking about? Abraham and Isaac, the story of obedience. And we're going to talk about what he's actually going to call worship. And that's going to be this. This is my favorite of all the pictures, of all the depictions. Not only what it shows, but where it's located. Okay? So this is the picture of Abraham sacrificing Isaac. There's the little sheep there that has not been found yet. He can't see it according to the picture, but it's right there. God's going to provide for him. But my favorite part about this is where this picture was. Can anybody guess? It's next to Lance's door. And I think it's so great because people who've never been in this building before, they show up and their child wants to participate in a camp. And they're told that they can go to Lance's door and they can sign up their child for a camp. And they walk in the picture right next to the youth minister's door is a guy with a knife trying to stab a little child. And I just think, welcome to Taylor Street. So glad that you're here. This is what we get. And having been a youth minister before, this is more real than you think. We took an oath to do exactly the opposite of the zealots. We took an oath not to carry a knife with us because if we did, we would have some explaining to do after we got done with the youth trip. But this is one picture, but I want to show a few more pictures because this is kind of what we think of. Or this is what a lot of times I think of when Abraham sacrifices Isaac. We have this kind of Bible school, cartoonish, drawn. I mean, this is kind of a very muted, cartoonish way of trying to illustrate what really happened. So I'll go back a few more years than this when I was a child, and I still have it. It's this real big, it's the Bible picture story book. And some of you may have had one of those growing up. It's pretty big, it's about that thing. It doesn't cover every story in the Bible, of course, but it has a lot of ones that you might want to pass on to your children. And so, which was the custom in our house, is that my dad would sit down and he would share a story with us from this Bible story picture book. And I can remember as a very young child, a very early memory, and I don't have very many of them. I can't remember them, but I can definitely remember this one. Flipping through the pages and seeing something that looked like this, and it was scary. I mean, there's some stories that, like, you see the illustration of it, even as devastating it was as the flood was in Genesis, with all the death that was involved and the chaos of that. You can see a picture of a boat with the animals lined up 2 by 2 about to go in. You say, oh, that's a really cool story. I want to know about that. But then you see this picture and you're like, what is going on here? And if you hadn't heard the story before, if you didn't know what's going on, you would say, well, at least what I thought was, I don't like this story. There's a really bad guy, and he's about to hurt that kid, and the angel has come in to save him. And this should be a story about how angels come in and save little kids from mean old people with knives. That was the story in my head. And actually, that story is a little closer than you think. That God would come in and save children and ultimately give up his own. But here's another picture. What do you think about that picture? Kind of get the same idea. And here you can see a little bit better. There's the ropes that are tied around the wrists of the child, and the man has a hand on the back of his head. And this is interesting because if you talk to Jews, they call this the adaka. And I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm not good with Hebrew, but it means the binding. And there's such great significance to the idea. It was not only the binding of the hands of the Son, it also is the binding of a worshiper to his Creator. Because of what God is ultimately going to do. And then this is not really for kids' eyes. It's a scary one. This is dark. You can see he's grabbed the chin and pulled it back. And there he is preparing to slit the throat of his son. That's how sacrifices would have taken place. Abraham knew this. And we look back just a few verses and we have Abraham making a sacrifice. I mean, this is something that was normal. You would take the animal, you'd slit its throat, it would bleed out, and then you would burn that as a sacrifice, an offering to God. And that seems kind of crazy and terrible, but honestly, that happens every single day. One of the things that I found interesting, I shared this last week, but we've been watching this show, my wife and I, this TV show called Alone. And basically what they do is they send 10 contestants out into the wilderness, and they're there completely by themselves. They have no contact with anybody else, and then all of a sudden they have to survive. And one thing I thought that was really interesting over and over again is these people, when they would take the life of an animal, whether it was a fish, whether it was a rabbit, whether it was a mouse. I know, gross. They would trap, kill, squish mice. But one thing I thought that was really interesting over and over again, that as they were pulling the fish out of the water, as they were pulling the mouse from underneath the trap, as they were taking the rabbit out of the snare, there was this very sacred moment where almost all of them would say, "Thank you for offering your life so that I could have mine." That was so interesting that this slimy fish or this nasty little rodent, they're like, "Thank you, because of you, I have life." Now, we don't think a lot about that because when we get our food, it's oftentimes wrapped up in a piece of paper, that says "enjoy your Whopper." Okay, we take out, but honestly, most of the time when we eat, it came at the cost of something that was living. Right? Okay, and so we don't think about that when we eat a hamburger or pizza or any number of things that, we may eat, eggs or chicken. But there was an animal that had to lose its life. Now, that's really quite similar to a sacrifice, in the sense that there is something that lost its life to give nourishment. And in a spiritual sense, that's what we're talking about when we talk about sacrifices. is that God demanded sacrifices so that people could understand that life had to be taken in order for life to be given. And he's going to double down on that in the New Testament. And we're going to see a lot of parallels in this passage to what takes place. I've left this on for quite a long time, haven't I? You're probably tired of looking at it. Look, the knife is falling out of his hand as this is happening. And I want to go into depth, because for those of you who think that God is mean and hateful, that he would ask Abraham to do that, I want you to hang on, because I think we're going to be reminded of what happens and how the story ends ultimately. But let's just get a quick background. Genesis 1 through 11 is going to cover the creation of the world. We're going to get stories about people like Noah. We're going to hear an extensive story about him. And then we're going to get into chapter 11, the very end of chapter 11. We're going to be introduced to a guy named Terah. We don't know a whole lot about Terah. But what we do know is he's going to have a son, and his son is going to be Abraham. We don't know exactly the worship habits of Terah, but we do know that Abraham is unlike anybody else before, in that he has this worship for God that seems to rise above everyone else. And so, you know the story. God is going to come to Abraham, or Abram at that time, and he's going to say, I want you to leave your family. And Abram is going to obey. And God's going to give him a promise from the very beginning. He says, you're going to be a great and mighty nation. And throughout, God is going to come to Abram over this long period of time. And Genesis 12 and following does not do justice to just how long it is. Okay? That he's going to wait over and over again. In fact, there's not anyone here in this room that was at the age of Abraham when he had children. He was given this promise. God sent him off. He's waiting for children. He's waiting for children. He's worshiping God. And then sometimes he makes some pretty poor decisions. At one point he says, you know what? God's not going to give me kids, or maybe he wants me to take matters into my own hands. And so he ended up taking Hagar, his wife's maidservant, and having Ishmael. And as a result, we still have wars. We have lots of wars that have spilled over from the Middle East over into here because of what took place then. Okay, it's a mess over there. And you can trace it back to the time that someone said, I'm not really trusting in God's plan. I'm going to take care of matters myself. And as a result, we've had several millennia of hate and war and fighting because of that decision. Ultimately, though, God is going to bless Abraham with a son, and he's going to name him what? Isaac. Now, this is a part of the story where we kind of lose touch with how much time has passed. So all we know is that God is now going to come to Abraham, father of Isaac, and he's going to talk to him. And we're going to take a deeper look at what worship really is. And so we're going to start in Genesis chapter 22. Okay? I've already said this once before, so I probably shouldn't say it again, but this is one of my favorite chapters. Genesis chapter 22, it says, sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And Abraham replied, here I am. And I've said this a million times, but it's worth saying again. Be careful when you ask for God to come and speak to you. Not every case, but almost every time God comes to speak to someone, he has news that is either tough to swallow or hard to follow. Abraham is going to get visited by God from the very beginning. He says, I want you to leave your family. And I want you to go somewhere. And Abraham says, great, will you just, text me a Google map so I know where we're going? And God says, nope. I'm not going to tell you. And so God is going to come to Abraham, and he's going to talk to him, and Abraham says, here I am. And God said, verse 2, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Okay, I can do that. God is going to send us on a trip. He wants to take my son, my only son, whom I love, that's Isaac, and we're going to go to the region of Moriah. And all is good so far. Road trip with God and Isaac. We can do this. We don't know how old Isaac is. We're going to learn in just a minute that he's old enough to carry his own wood. But he doesn't fully understand what's going on, although he may have some idea as they get closer and closer and that altar gets built. He says, sacrifice him there as a what? A what?
Burnt.
I didn't pull up a picture of what that might look like. And this is just a kind of a sensitive subject for me right now, because I'm longing to see my son. I'd love to hear his voice. Jennifer and I have said, you know what? If he texts, we're going to text back. We may shoot a text here and there, but we're going to give him space. But man, I would love to see him. I'd love to get a hug from him, to hear his voice, to go have lunch together. And the thought of something bad happening to him right now, even just having a bad day, is just heartbreaking. Just for those of you who are a little bit older, you know that I grew up, or as an adult, I began thinking about, I am every day, my son, I'm inching, pushing him further and further away, so that at some point his feet leave the nest and he's going to go down, and I don't know where he's going. And I can't reach out there and grab him anymore. I have to say, Molly, you're shaking your head. You know exactly what this is. I had no clue. I mean, I could talk about it, and in theory, I knew about it, but just the heartbreak of saying, I have no idea what's going on right now is just killing me. But that's nothing compared to what God has just asked Abraham to do. Burnt offering. Oh, I would do anything to protect my children. I would do anything to protect my girls. The idea of my children suffering like that is just beyond what I can visualize or imagine. Tying up your child. Guys, I don't want to be gruesome, but this is part of Scripture. Tying them up, putting them on the altar, and slitting their throat. It's what Abraham had done to other animals. It's what has to happen to animals every day in order for us to eat meat. And yet here we have God coming to Abraham and saying, I want you to do harm to your child. The one that you love, your only son, I want you to take him. I want you to sacrifice him. I want you to burn his body. I mean, I don't want to go too dark of a place, but can you imagine? Can you imagine picking up your child? 8 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old, and setting them on top of the wood of the altar that you are asked to build, as they're bound up, and you have to reach for that knife. Maybe it starts off with them asking questions like Isaac did, but at what point do they see that knife and say, please don't do this? And what we're going to talk about over the course of the next few minutes is the word that Abraham is going to use to describe this event. And he's going to call it worship. Again, worship beyond anything else is obedience. And we're going to look at that a little bit later after we get towards the end of Genesis 22 after this story. He says, sacrifice in there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. That's the period, the end of the quotation. That's the end of verse 2. And then we just have verse 3. This is not a Jonah story. I don't know what's going on here. It just seems odd to me that the sun goes down and it comes up again, and Abraham is headed out the door. He's not fleeing. He's not complaining. He's not questioning. It just says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. I think the Hebrew was important that they stayed true to the story. They did not say, Abraham woke up. Why do you suppose they did not say, Abraham woke up? Because I have a pretty good idea that after hearing that kind of news, there would be no sleep the night before. How could you, God? We've wanted this child. You promised him to us. He is everything. He's not just a child, but he's also our hopes and our dreams of a future that you promised for us. The loss of a child is so much more than just losing that physical person. It's all the future that you have together. Of all the hopes and dreams of grandkids and Thanksgiving meals and times together, all of that, when God says, I want you to take your son and I want you to sacrifice him. Just every part of me screams, God, what are you doing here? We do this way too often. We jump ahead to the story, the end of the story where there's the ram in the thicket, and we say, oh, God will provide. God has not provided at this point. God has demanded a sacrifice from Abraham of his son, and Abraham is going to worship God that morning. No pews, no 728B, no raising of hands, just getting up and doing what God has called him to do. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. I just wonder, he's sitting here, he is cutting up wood for an altar that he's going to build to God and burn his son up. I wonder what it felt like to swing that axe as he's cutting up that wood. Is he swinging it in anger with all that he has because he's so hurt that God would request such an action? Is he swinging it halfway because he's thinking maybe God's going to step in? Maybe if I run out of energy, I don't know. I'm just trying to think, what would a father think as he's attempting to worship God in this way? On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. On the 3rd day, they had to travel. There had to have been lots of conversations. We don't know exactly how old Isaac is. But surely as they walk along the way, you think Abraham is soaking up every word that his son says? You think that he's questioning every step that he takes? You think he's constantly in prayer, saying, God, if there's any other way you can do this? Sound familiar? Sound words of Jesus in the garden? Worship is obedience, and it's submission, and it's exactly what we see Abraham doing. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will" what? Worship, and then we will come back to you. We'll get back to that verse. Just fantastic verse. Genesis 22:5. That is a highlighter, underlining, starring in the margin type of verse. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So what just happened now? Physically, what just happened? What's Isaac doing?
Preparing to sacrifice his son.
Yeah. Isaac is carrying what with him? The wood. Are we seeing? We're going to see lots more parallels, but this is one of the parallels. Okay. Isaac is going to carry wood up a mountainside in order to be a sacrifice. Jesus is going to carry wood up a mountainside in order to be a sacrifice. So many parallels between this and what Jesus is ultimately going to do. The ending is going to be a little different, though. As the two of them went on together, this just breaks my heart. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And what do you say then? I mean, we know Abraham's going to have an amazing response. In fact, Hebrews is going to talk a little bit about the faith of Abraham. But nonetheless, he's heading up the mountain with the knife, the fire, the son who's carrying the wood. And Isaac says, "Hey, Dad, where's the offering?" He's old enough to understand what's going to take place. We have the wood, we have the fire, we have the knife. We're going to go up there and there's going to be a sacrifice. But we're missing something. "Hey, Dad, where is that? Do we need to go back? We forgot that." And Abraham simply responds with what? God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And if that is not the most prophetic statement in the Bible, I don't know what is. He says, God will provide the lamb. And the two of them went together, still trudging up the mountain. And maybe that appeases Isaac, but to Abraham, don't you imagine he still has to have that knot in his stomach? Do you want to run up the mountain because you just think, I've got to get this over with? Do you want to walk as slow as possible thinking maybe this won't actually happen? But finally, in verse 9, they reached the place God had told them about. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. So he's getting everything ready. Can you imagine? He's got to get an altar big enough to place his son on. We don't know how big he is, but he's big enough that he can carry enough wood to ultimately allow himself to be burned. So it's probably a decent amount of wood, so he's going to be a decent size. It's enough wood to burn up his body. And they've gone up the mountain, and now Abraham is building this altar, and the thing I keep asking is, why would you do this, God? Don't you know? This isn't right. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. It's been probably about a year ago, and it's something I'd never really thought about that, but Michael Chaney was leading us in communion thoughts, and he talked about what happened after Jesus was taken down from the cross. Nicodemus was there, and they took his body and they carried it, and he talked about the weight of carrying an adult male and how difficult it would have been, and the struggle of just carrying that body. And you just have to think about Abraham. He's over 100 years old. He's got his son who, has to weigh anywhere from 70 to, 100 150 pounds, something like that, and he had to, bind them. What did that look like? Okay, Isaac, here's what's going to happen. I need you to lay down on the ground. Or just sit over here. Will you cross your legs? Will you put your ankles together? Why are we doing this?
He was obeying God.
We don't know the age of Isaac. But we have to get a sense that in the same way that Abraham trusted God, Isaac had been raised in such a way that he trusted his father. And just to go to that dark place again. And I don't know that I can say this. I just can't fathom my son or one of my daughters and kneeling down and tying up their legs in their hands as they ask questions. As they try to look stoically, as they refuse to make eye contact, or as they stare and beg, please don't do this, Dad. We don't know the reaction of Isaac. We just know that they're being bound up. He's being bound up. Can you imagine? I can't imagine. Of course, my son's a little bit bigger. I'm not sure I could pick him up. But can you imagine just the struggle, feeling the weight, and holding that child close to you as you heave them up onto the wood? The branches start to crack under the weight. It's painful. Why would you put your child on that wood? Bound up. And every part of me is screaming, just stop. You can't do this. Please don't do this. I go back and think of those pictures of what it would take for somebody to be willing to even get to this point. Just to get to this point. Worship is obedience. It's not always about the praise songs and the hallelujahs and the celebration of the victories. It is sometimes just the guttural, raw brokenness of life. When God allows you to be in a place that devastates you. When He calls you to places and to things that you never thought you would imagine. This is what worship is. And this is why I'm really concerned about this misconstrual of worship. Because when we associate worship only as praising God when things go good, it breaks the faith of people who didn't believe or didn't know or had never heard that worship is sometimes going up the mountain with your son. Because I can look in this room and I can see people who have worshiped in hospital rooms as their spouse is breathing their last breath. Worship is sending off your child to kindergarten. Those can be tough days. Sending your kids off to college, sending your kids off to camp for a week. Worship can be working in an environment around people who don't know or love the Lord. Worship is flat tires and headaches and reports of cancer. Worship is what happens not only in the good times, but also in the tough times. And this is where we meet Abraham. And this is where we find out what worship really is. It is obedience. And so he picks up his son. He places him on the wood that's been arranged there. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And this is where we freeze frame and get all of these pictures. And you just imagine, what kind of person does it take to do something like this? It takes someone who believes in God and a plan that is greater than what he can imagine. We don't know all that's going through his head, but the writer of Hebrews tells us a little bit in Hebrews chapter 11. It's the chapter of faith, right? It's one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. But in that, it talks about Abraham. It says that he had such faith in God that he believed that even if he killed his son and sacrificed him, that God would bring him back to life. How crazy of a story is that? That as he's going up, he says, this hasn't been done before. But Abraham believes if I kill my son, because that's what God has asked me to do, he'll raise him back to life. And he has this faith. No matter what happens, I'm going to do what God asked me to do. Right? And so he pulls out the knife. And then God steps in. And I love this. And God is going to stop Abraham from doing what he ultimately will do himself. And a lot of us can ask, why would he do this? Why did he have to do this? Is this to, trick Abraham to be mean, Was it Lucy who would do this? It was Lucy, right? Lucy did this to Charlie. Wasn't it Lucy? I get the girls confused on Peanuts. What did Lucy always do? Like, she'd pull the football away, and Charlie, you'd see him do the backflips. She kept doing it over and over again. Is this what God's doing here? Like, hey, watch this. Whoa, I pull away. Oh, that's funny. Is that what God's doing here?
No, it was a test to do with his faith.
So the test, is this a test for God or a test for Abraham?
For Abraham.
And Isaac.
But God knew what Abraham was going to do, so why would he test him? Could it be that because Abraham didn't really know what Abraham was going to do? We talked about this several years ago. There's this phenomenon that took place during World War II. I know you hate to hear about this because I'm always referencing back because it's just amazing to me. But at one point, Germany was just bombing London day after day after day. In fact, I can't remember. I want to think it was like 147 days straight. They bombed them, and they kept bombing because what they said was, we will break the will of the British people if we just keep bombing London over and over again. England will say, we've had enough of this. And this weird thing happened that psychologists and sociologists studied years later, but it was interesting to them is that every time the bombs landed, the next day, the people of London seemed to be stronger than before. It's like they were absorbing the energy from the bombs, and if they survived, they ended up being stronger. And while the bombs were in fact devastating, and it did take the lives of a lot of people, there were a lot more people who didn't die. And it seemed like the more times the bombs hit, the more it just hardened their resolve. We will not give up. Even to the point that they almost thought, like, we're invincible. Like, I've made it through 100 days of bombing. I'm still alive. I'm not going to stop. And so maybe this was kind of the psychology behind this. When Abraham went through this and said, if I can make it through God asking me to sacrifice my son, then there is nothing that I can't do. And he even thought maybe God will provide and raise him back to life. He could believe that. And Julie mentioned this is not only the results of the test were not only seen by Abraham, but guess else who saw them? Isaac. And I think a bigger part of this story that we overlook is that during this time there were lots of other beliefs and deities and other gods that it was not uncommon for these gods to demand sacrifice of children. Now, where these people got this idea that they should serve a God, that they should create this God, and then hear the God tell them that they need to sacrifice their children is just unfathomable to me. But lots and lots and lots of children died in this way. And I think a bigger part of this story is that Yahweh, the God of Israel, would say, you don't sacrifice children. I'm going to be the one who stops that. Because when it comes time for a sacrifice of a son, you let me take care of that. That's this beautiful story of Abraham. And so now we're going to rewind real quickly back to verse 5. Favorite verse. I'm saying it and I mean it. Abraham is speaking to the servant. He said to his servants, he says, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and we will come back to you. There's three quick things I love about just that statement. The last one, it says, we will come back to you. We will come back to you. He's saying, I believe that we're going to come back down from the mountain. The second that it says just prior to that, he says, we're going to go worship. Guys, I want you to understand that when you have a flat tire and you pull over on the side of the road, that is the cue for, that is your call to worship. When you get that phone call, when that nagging coworker walks into the office, when the yapping dog starts barking in the middle of the night, when somebody with 72 items gets in front of you at the 20 items or less lane, that is your call to worship. When your waitress gets the order wrong, that is your call to worship. When you get cut off, oh, don't get me started. Don't. When you have to drop your child off at the freshman high school, and somebody decides that the drive-through lane is now the I'm going to park sideways across it and go inside lane. And you have to figure out, what am I going to do for the next 10 minutes? Well, that car is parked sideways and nobody can move and the people behind you are honking and you can't do anything about it. That is your call to worship. That we will worship. If you don't get anything from this morning, my prayer is this. You will begin to grasp what worship is, and that worship happens on mountains and in valleys. Everywhere in between. And then we'll close out with this last thing that he says in verse 5. He looks at the servant and he says, hey, you stay here with the donkeys. And he says, my son and I, we will go worship. And that to me is the most prophetic statement, because what he's saying is this, that what has to happen is between the Father and the Son. And ultimately, that's what's going to happen. As we are broken in our sin and we don't know what to do, God says, you don't go up the mountain. You don't take your son. You stay here. That's something that I'm going to do with my son. And we will come back down. And so this week, as you continue to think about what worship is, may you remember that it is, above all else, it is obedience to God. And so my prayer is that we will be faithful in our worship and be looking for ways and listen to the voice of God as He calls us to go into this world and show His love to others. Let's close out in prayer. Father God, I thank you again for being just an amazing, awesome God. You are worthy of our worship. The worship that takes place here, the worship that happens with eyes lifted, with hands raised, with joy in our heart. That is worship for you. May we be zealous and have such great spiritual fervor as we worship you. But Lord, I pray that our worship continues. Not just on Sunday morning, but Lord, on Monday morning. When that alarm goes off, may that be our call to worship you. That as we walk into our places of worship, may that be our places of work. May that be our call to worship you. When the copier doesn't work, when the coworker complains, when the boss comes in and asks us to do something, Lord, may that be our call to worship. May we give you glory and honor as we find ourselves sometimes walking up the mountain with the fire and the knife. May we be willing to be obedient to you in all things. God, thank you most importantly for being a God who says, I don't ask you to give up your children. Instead, you say, I will sacrifice my one and only Son, that he will carry the wood, that he will be bound on top of the mountain, and that his sacrifice will allow us an eternity with you. Lord, may we live that out this week. It's the name of Jesus that I pray. Amen. Thank you for being here. We are closing out our study of parables this Wednesday at 6 o'clock, so please join us for that. You are dismissed.